Okay, our next topic after we've learned the basics of database concepts, and believe me, this is an extremely crash course to get you up and running to create a PHP MySQL application. So the first thing we want to do is we want to model our data, and this can happen in a variety of ways. The easiest way is just to do this with a piece of paper, but there are lots of database modeling programs out there. Some of them are for free. Generally, if you're wanting to get this started and going, there's no problem doing this with paper. If you want to get more involved in database administration, there are tools for MySQL, which is what we'll be using. Um, for an example, the MySQL Workbench is a free download that you can use to create this in the software, and then it will automatically do your data model for you to create your physical database. Okay, so in our last video we talked about how the nouns of our user stories are going to become the entities for our database, and those entities translate into tables. So let's take an example of designing a very simple database, or actually just a couple tables for a simple social network. So our social network will be a simple website application powered by MySQL PHP that will track data about our user and their interests. We will connect them with other users. Again, very simplistic. Each one of you will have your own ideas, and each of those ideas will translate into a different set of entities and attributes. So keep that in mind. This is just to kind of give you an idea of the process here. Okay, so the very first thing that you want to do, it's very important that you start with your user stories. What do we want our user to be able to do? So in any website development process, we're going to want to consider our user. That's the whole point of building the system. So this is no different with a PHP MySQL system. It's actually probably even more important because we need to be able to represent all of the items that we want them to be able to do in the database. So if you have a very detailed list of the user stories for every single thing that the user should be able to do, you can ensure that you've got all the entities, and that will help you inform your attributes and really make sure that you're taking consideration of everything you want them to be able to do. So I've only given a few here, but I would recommend that you really sit down and think about what you want to do. Now, in any case, when you're first starting a site, it's best to kind of think small. Start small, build up from there, and you can always add other things on in future releases. When I first started learning how to program and how to make database applications, this is exactly what I did. I started with a social network way back when, 20 years ago, and I continued to build upon it and add new features, and it was a really great learning experience for me because as my skills improved, I was able to do some pretty cool stuff. So again, every single thing that I built for my social network came from an idea of a vision of what I wanted the user to be able to do. So you need to have that vision, and you really need to think about this from a systems perspective. So in my fictitious little social network here, the very first thing that I want someone to be able to do is to register for the website. Because if we don't have users, we don't have a social network, right? So we want them to register for their website. And again, I would recommend, you don't hit them with like tons of data up front. Think about the minimum information that you need from a user in order to put them in your database. And then they can always fill out more information about them. So think about, Facebook. We've got some basic information, and you look at their homepage for their sign up, it's very short form. And then once you become a member, then you can kind of go in and edit your profile and add more information. Think about LinkedIn, same thing, you add some basic information, and then you can like spend all day adding all your employment history and your education and all those things. And each one of those features requires many more tables of, of rows of information that you're storing. Okay, so a user has to register for our website. A user can create a profile page with their interests, photos, and short posts. Okay, so just right there, I'm probably going to want to have a couple different tables because I don't want all of this content sitting in my user table. That user table is going to be the table that checks to see if their password and their username match when they log in. So I don't want to bog it down with a bunch of details about these our users' lives. I just want the basic information in the user table. Then I can branch out to other tables to store their extra information, like their posts and stuff like that. If you think about like Twitter, allowing them to make posts, okay? Same thing with photos. If there's anything that they're going to have more than one of, you definitely want to have that in a separate table so that you can have that information away from other things. Okay, here's a couple other ones. A user can view other users' profile pages. So, you're going to have to think how you want to do that because there's lots of rules that you can say, maybe hey, they can only view the profile page of another user if they're their friend, right? So maybe they can just see the basic information about someone before they can actually see their profile page. So if you think about what sort of privacy options you're going to want to give your users. Now again, for the purpose of just experimenting and building this out and seeing how it works, it isn't as necessary that we, really provide extensive privacy options, but maybe that would be something that you would add when you started really getting users for your site. Maybe at the beginning, when you have 0 users, it's not as important to keep as much stuff private as it would be if you had, 50,000 users. Okay, what else do we want them to use? A user can become friends with another user. So how would that work, right? So if you think about it, we're going to have a user ID for each of our users, and how can they become friends with another user? If you think about that, again, you're not going to want to store a list of every single user's friends in the user table. You're going to want to pull that out and associate those 2 user IDs in one row of a table. So you can see how quickly this could grow. Some people on Facebook, have thousands of friends, right? That's each one of those friendships is a row in a database table. So it can get pretty crazy. Okay, so think about the user stories. Keep it simple, okay? Don't complicate things at the beginning while you're first learning. You can always add more user stories or modify the user stories or make them more complex as you go along. Okay, so we're going to start with major nouns. Now, just from the short information that I've provided, I can see that I have to have a user. There's definitely going to be a user. There's definitely going to be a user profile. And then there's definitely going to need to be some sort of user-friend relationship. So let's start with the obvious one, user. So the first thing I'm going to do is think of associated attributes. I'm going to make a list of everything that I want to store. And this information you see here in front of you is not an exhaustive list. This is just what would fit on the screen. So things like username, a password, first name, last name, city, state, zip code, gender. Okay, there's many more things that you might want to include in here. But these are the things that I thought I could at least make happen and make some sort of connections with other people. Okay, and then after you think about all these attributes, again, you can just write this down on a piece of paper. Think about the data type. What would the data look like that you would want to store in each of these attributes? Now, I kind of just went for easy here, and I picked a varchar with a limit of 30 characters. So that means they could technically have a username full with 30 characters. And what a varchar does is it allocates a certain amount of space in the database, but it can expand. So if their username is Ted, that's only 3 characters. So the varchar will allow that field to kind of grow and expand based on the needs of what is actually inside of it. So it's a good way to save some space in your database by using varchar. Whereas if you take a look at the state, I set that to just a car, or care if you want to call it that, of 2. So Obviously, I'm sitting here assuming that for right now this is going to be like a United States only type deal. And again, that is something you need to consider if it's going to be a website used internationally, then you're probably going to want to modify this so that it isn't just for just doesn't record information for the United States. So anyway, let's just assume for right now we're doing this for the United States only, and I'm specifying 2 characters for the state. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a drop down box and it's going to have a pre-populated list of what the values, the 2 character values are for each state. So I know that I want to record this information and I know that it's going to be 2 characters. So because it's not going to expand and grow like the varchar, I can hard code in character, save me 2 spaces for this particular field name. Same thing with the zip code. I mean, I could probably use varchar for that because if people enter a 5-digit zip code, this will either expand to 5 digits or the long version of their zip code. And note that I didn't include this as an integer because a zip code is technically characters. We don't necessarily do math calculations on zip codes. So I'm not going to store that as an integer. And then same thing with gender. Gender, I'm going to have some options for them to choose from, and then that character will be represented with 1 character, which is the smallest that I can do, right? Okay. All right, next. What attributes are required? So what am I going to make them input? Like, you can't go forward unless you have this information. So you need to make those decisions. That's a decision for the designer, you know. And if you see, I made everything required except for city. Maybe they're not comfortable putting their city in. So, but I want to have a state and a zip code. Well, I guess in some ways the zip code kind of gives you an idea where the city is. But maybe I don't show the zip code anywhere to other users like I might the city and state. Maybe I just use the zip code for like geolocation to try and figure out who's within 25 miles of you or something like that. Okay, so think about that. And again, this is kind of a privacy thing. What information are you forcing them to input? Oh, you know, one thing I realized I didn't include in here that is a must is an email address. How am I going to communicate with my users? Right? So definitely want to have an email address in here as well. And that would be required so I could communicate with them. Okay, the next question, is there a unique identifier that exists? So first take a look at what you have here and really think about it. Is there something like a social security number or a VIN number, these natural primary keys, natural unique identifiers? And in most cases there won't be. So what we do is we create a primary key to enforce a unique identifier. And that way we can associate each user with a particular unique identifier. So that's the first step that you want to do. So if there isn't one, in most cases there won't, you're going to want to create one. And what you want to do is for that is you want to, that's usually the very first attribute. So I put it at the top. You usually want these to be an integer. And then you're going to, in MySQL, you're going to specify that it's a primary key and then it's an auto increment. So that means that the database will handle the numbering. It will start with 1 and 50,000 people later it will be 50,001. Okay, so it will keep track of the next person for you. It's a really cool feature and makes your life a lot easier than trying to have to see what the next number would be. Okay, and of course that's going to be required, but that's going to be behind the scenes, right? The user isn't going to input their own user ID. That's something that gets handled by MySQL. Okay, then you're going to go to the next entity, define the attributes and the data type. So again, I didn't put much in here because I mean this really depends on what the idea of your site is. So maybe I just have an about me, and what I put here is I put like text. Okay, so we have shorter character fields for short words, names, things like that, can be varchar. But with something that you expect them to write, maybe a paragraph or something, then you're going to want to use that as a text type data type. And again, that kind of allows things to expand up to a certain point. There's like small text, large text, data type fields, and you'll be able to see those different data types once we get into MySQL. Okay, so I've got about me, interest, and then I put like a profile image, and what we do is we store the name of the image that they're going to upload. So in PHP, we're going to use our little image upload process, and instead of storing the actual image in the database, we're just going to store the name of the file for that image. And we're going to make sure it's a unique file name so that we don't pull up someone else's image called me.jpg. And then this could be like their primary profile image. And then if you have a tool that lets them upload a lot of images, that would probably be a separate table that would associate those other images with them. Okay, so you're going to do the same exact thing here with the data type. You're going to add your primary key. So I'm adding user profile ID, and you'll notice that I generally make my ID be the same as the name of the table, all lowercase with an underscore ID. So that's something that it helps me see the difference. Now, the next step is to make connections. This is the whole point of a relational database, is that things are related to one another. So right now you can see we've got our user table, and now we have a user profile table. And when someone registers for our site, we're going to put a row in the user table. But we're also going to want to put a row in the user profile table. But how do we associate those tables together? We do that using a foreign key. So you'll notice I've still have my primary key here, user profile ID, but then I've put a second one called user ID. Okay, and this associates this record with the correct user from my user table. Now, technically, I could probably do this the other way around. I could put the user profile ID in the user table. One of them needs to have a foreign key so that they make that connection. I see my user table as kind of the more important table here, right? This is the first table that I'm going to insert anything into once they register. And then when they go to their profile page, then once that happens, I'm going to make sure that they have a row that exists in the user profile table. So that's why I'm using the user ID as a foreign key sitting inside my user profile table. It's kind of like which comes first, the duck or the egg, right? So in this case, my user table is the main table of my site. So you will see that user ID associated with all of my like supplemental tables. Okay, it's very important that you have this. Okay, and the way that you can do this, if you think about your login process in PHP, you set a session variable that saves your user ID, and so that you can reference that user ID whenever you need to enter a new row in another table. Okay, so that's what we do. If you wanted to see like the logic behind the profile page, so say they register for the site, you get their basic information. You take that information, you validate it, you check that everything is there that needs to be there, and then you create a SQL statement that adds that row into our user table. Then you route them to whatever their home page is for the logged in users. And then maybe there's a button that says edit your profile. You click edit your profile. That will first run a query that will look to see if we already have a record in user profile with this particular user ID. If we do, we'll take that information that might be stored and we'll display it on the page and allow them to review it and edit it if they want to. If it doesn't exist, then we're going to create a new record in the user profile with nothing really in it except the primary key and the foreign key, and then they can input things into a form and save it from there. Okay, so that's some of the logic behind how this might work. Okay, so then you're going to continue with all of your remaining entities. So if you're doing a site that has a bunch of college colleges listed, you're going to need a table for college, and they're all going to have a college ID. If you're making a table where they register for a class, you're going to need a table with a class. If you're making your table or you're making a database where you have local businesses stored, you're going to need to have a table for those businesses. And then if there's any sort of relationship between the user and that business, that needs to be a middle table, a lookup table that will basically store and connect that user with that table. So if you're doing like Yelp and you've got a list of businesses, local businesses in the area, that's a separate table, and then you've got your user table. If a user wants to place a review on that business, there needs to be a third table called, user business or something. And within it, it needs to have a foreign key to both the business ID and the user ID. And then from there, you'll create your content, and that's how you'll connect to it. So make a list of all the attributes and data types for all entities that you can think of. Okay, determine which attributes are required for your application to work, and in terms of which ones you have to have them input. Add primary keys for all tables. Every single table needs to have a primary key, a unique identifier. Make connections to related tables via foreign keys. Most tables are connected to at least one other table. Some are connected to two in that example with the user and business. Okay, so if you have tables sitting out there that are just kind of floating around with no connection, then you might want to take a look at that. That might not be right. Okay? Okay, after that, you're going to examine your database model for accuracy. So here's an example of a MySQL data model, and this can be built in MySQL Workbench. So again, like I told you, everyone kind of has different ways of how they want to do their table names and field names. This doesn't go with my example. I like my table names to be all uppercase and my field names to be all lowercase. So you'll see here, these little boxes all represent an entity or a table. This is the name of the table, and then you'll see a little key, a little golden key next to the primary key, and then all the other elements are either blue or red, and I think maybe you can tell the difference between the red ones here. If you take a look and follow these little lines here, this is pointing, it's a foreign key pointing to the locations table. This red one is a foreign key that connects to the user table. So all these lines form these connections. A user table connects to user settings table. Okay, because again, we don't necessarily want to store all this information in our user table. We want this to be very simple, and then we pull out things. Here's this following relationships, right? This is exactly what you'd want to do for a friendship table. Okay, so here's their primary key. Here's the user ID of the person. So this is my Facebook account, and you're connecting me with back to the user table, but you're calling the foreign key something different, following ID. So this is the person's ID that I'm following, the person I'm friends with. And then the date I followed. So a lot of times you're going to want to put date information in, right? It allows us to kind of get some statistical data here too. If you have a user, see right here in the users table, it has a date registered. That gives us a good idea as a website app developer here and the owner of this website, gives us an idea when people are coming to our site. And do the same thing. A lot of times people will track the user login. So in my social network, I tracked every time someone logged in, I put another record in my user login table that recorded when they logged in, and it's easy to tell when they logged in because you have to run a process, and you could technically have an associated log out, but really if you think about it, most of us just log into Facebook, and especially if it's our personal computer, it's just kind of logged in all the time. And then we go to that tab when we want to when we want to see what's going on. So a lot of people don't log out of things, but they definitely log in. So we can kind of see, how long they were there, and how often they come and visit our site. That way, if you want to kind of give like a special incentive to people who are frequent users of your site, you have that information that you can track. And you can say, oh, you've logged into my site 1,000 times since, 2 weeks ago. So you must be a really big fan. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind and add those little things for yourself. Okay, once you've got everything, your data model all set up, then you can create your physical database in MySQL. And in this project that we're working on, we'll log into our web server cPanel accounts. We're going to use PHPMyAdmin to create our physical database. If you're watching and you don't have a web server, you can always get one online for about $4 or $5 a month. Generally, if you get like a 4-year package, you might be able to get that down to $3 a month. Whereas if you get a 12-month package, you might be paying closer to $5 or $6 a month. And there are some free things out there as well, but if you are one of my students in my class, I have already provided you with information on your cPanel, how to access your cPanel account. Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for watching. Bye.